What's up, Wizards? It's Dev. Big tournaments over this last weekend as Standard continues to get a little bit more attention than it's used to lately. So, were there any more big breakout decks from these tournaments, or did the meta decide to reassert itself? Let's talk.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. It was a qualifier weekend this time around. We had a regional championship qualifier and we had a Wizards Play Network qualifier. Both reasonably well-attended events. One of them had just under 100 players. One had about 130. So, again, pretty big-time events for this day and age in Magic the Gathering, especially Standard. So, let's take a quick look at what exactly went down first at the regional championship qualifier. Now, don't get too excited there, because I know that if you can see your screen, it says Abs and Counters right there. And that looks like a brand new deck. What is Abs and Counters? It's actually entirely mislabeled, and it shouldn't say Abs and Counters. This is actually just a Boros deck that you've seen like a million times. Boros aggro with Novice Inspector, Voldaren Epicure, Warden of the Inner Sky, Knight Errant of Eos, Resolute Reinforcement, Zibidane's Recruiter, Sanguine Evangelist, Regal Bunnycorn. I won't say that it's new technology. It's actually kind of old technology for this deck, but got a player that's still on two of them. I really like this. Down to 3 War Leaders Call, 3 Case of the Gateway Express. Got to fit in those bunnies somehow, right? Got Gleeful Demolition in here like you might expect to see. Anyway, this is a deck that, again, you're probably familiar with at this point in the meta. And it went 5-0 at this bad boy right here. 5-0. A few decks actually went 5-0 at this event. Not only Abs and Counters, but the Abs and Counters. Boros Convoke is what this actually is. Got me again. But Mono Red Aggro returns, we'll call it. I'm not sure that you really want to call it a comeback. It has, in fact, been here for years, but it's just not a deck that you see very often in current meta, especially in best of 3. You see it all day in best of 1 on MTG Arena, but not as often in big-time tournament best of 3 Magic. But it's not necessarily the exact same build that we've been seeing recently either. This has your Charming Scoundrels and your Monastery Swiftspears, your Phoenix Chicks, your Feldons, they're all in there. Kumano Faces Kakazan, a lot of the stuff that you're probably used to seeing. Lightning Strike, Play with Fire, Monstrous Rage, Witch Stalker Frenzy to kill the big guys. You know, it's not necessarily anything new, except for a couple of pieces of technology here. First of all, Fugitive Codebreaker is new from MKM. This is 2 mana for a 2/1 Prowess Haste, which is already kind of okay. It's no Swiftspear, but it's not terrible. Now, you can disguise it and, pay 3 mana to get a 2/2 Ward 2, and then you flip it up for 6 mana, but you pay 1 less for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. When you flip it up, you discard your hand, you draw 3 cards. That is actually really, really good gas for a deck like this. But if you need more gas, you got Case of the Crimson Pulse down here, which is also brand new out of NKM. When an ETB, you discard a card, draw 2 cards, it costs 3 mana for this Tormenting Voice, right? But you solve it if you don't have any cards in your hand. And then from that point on, you're going to discard your hand and draw 2 cards at the beginning of your upkeep every single turn. So, again, incredible gas for a deck like this. 3 does seem like a bit hefty, but who am I to say that? Because this deck went 5-0, and it's just, again, not something that we always see from a deck like Mono Red these days, right? So, again, interesting new tech, but is it really new tech? But in any case, a deck that you might expect to see here too is Azorius Control, and it is here. I have said recently that I'm not really sure there's a reason to play anything but Azorius Control in the current environment. If you want to go fast, you play Boros Convoke. If you want to control the game, of course you play Control. But I think Azorius Control is in a better spot than it's been in a really long time, and I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. There's not a whole lot of new technology I'm spotting right off the get-go, like a cursory glance of the deck. There are 28 lands in here, which is slightly more than you would normally see. I think 27 is what you often see in these control decks, but drops are that important. Aside from that, Wandering Emperor, Lockdown, Sunfall, Depopulate, Farewell, 4 Marches, 4 Memory Deluge, 4 No More Lies, 3 Deduce, 2 Get Lost, and 1 Disruption Protocol. So a pretty typical list here. You got your Chrome Host Seed Shark in the sideboards, 4 Knockout Blow against, wow, that's kind of amazing, against aggro decks. Disdainful Stroke, negate, unlicensed hearse to play around in yards, and then Farewell in here. So again, pretty typical sideboard, pretty typical list. I will say that a lot of these decks are running a lot more lands. It appears as though the 28th land, that extra slot, has gone to a 4th Field of Ruin, because they will absolutely not die to creature lands or Mirexes or anything. Otherwise, they would. We went from 2 to 3 to 4 now, Field of Ruins in these blue-white control lists. And apparently, if you do that, you get to 5-0 an event. Aside from that, the top 8 is rounded out by other decks you've probably seen before. 2 Dimir decks in a row. And if you haven't seen these recently, this is one of, to my mind, the better decks in the format. You curve out with Spyglass Siren and a Deep Cavern Bat. You got Preacher of the Schism on 3, Gix on 3, and your 2 flyers on the first 2 turns will help you draw some cards off Gix. Urtai for some tempo, Sheoldred because it's so good. You got an Aclazotz because it's tough to deal with, Lazav because it can do a bunch of different stuff. Some number of Cryptic Coats. This list plays 1, 4 Make Disappear for some, again, tempo, some counter magic, 3 Go for the Throat, 2 Cut Down, just solid removal. And then an Anoint with Affliction in this particular list, but sometimes you'll see Long Goodbye or Bitter Triumph or even Infernal Grasp, but often it's Long Goodbye in this slot recently. That said, really have been liking what this deck has been doing recently. I just like the way it curves out, and I also like the way it's equipped to deal with a lot of other decks in the meta. Sometimes if it goes second against like Boros Convoke, it's going to have some problems, but it can actually sort of out-tempo control in a lot of the mid-range decks, a lot of the ramp decks, because you're actually putting things on the board, but you do have the counter magic that ramp decks hate and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's in an interesting spot right now where it can counter stuff with Make Disappear against ramp and mid-range and stuff and still close the game before they can just continue to cast large spells. That's pretty important. Aside from that, Dimir mid-range, again, very similar deck here. It's basically the same deck, adding Tishana's Tidebinder, which is another card you'll often see in here. This deck plays Subterranean Schooner. I should have noted that the first deck doesn't. Dimir midrange largely in the last season was a boat deck. You're just trying to get the boat to do some stuff, But in this format, we see people cutting boat more often. I do still think it's a pretty important card. Golgari midrange is also here, a deck we've seen an awful lot of recently. This one playing one of Nissa Ascended Animus, the 7 mana but can be 5 mana Planeswalker. I've really been liking this card lately. I've been playing it in everything from almost Bant, like green-white ramp, to a sort of green-black Golgari, Up the Beanstalk deck. And I've been playing it as a 3 of in both of those lists, and it's really, really good right now. The -1 Destroy an Artifact or Enchantment is fantastic. It's really, really, really good. And obviously just being able to tick up and create a huge guy at return is great. Later on in the game, if you have the board set up to do it, it can come down to just end the game. And a deck like this can do that because it's got all these creatures, Mosswood Dread Knight is great in longer games to help you keep up the card advantage. Deep Cavern Bat takes stuff away from your opponent. Preacher's just a great little 3-drop to help bridge the gap. Sheoldred, another good bridge card, obviously, your opponent must deal with. Gix, another Gix deck. We see this as being one of the strongest cards in the format right now. Glissa Sunslayer, just a couple of them, but she's a very strong card too. Sentinel of the Nameless City, all these like utility 3-drops, right? Sharp-Eyed Bricky, just a 2 of, and you don't always see this in the Golgari decks, and I kind of like this, attempted technology here. The deck does need to draw more cards outside of just Mosswood Dread Knight, and this really helps it do that, so I like that idea. Archfiend of the Dross in here, and don't always see it, but you have been seeing this card pop up more in sort of mono-black aggro lists people are tinkering with lately, and so I like the inclusion of it here. I've also gone on record lately as saying I really like Phyrexian Fleshgorger's sort of position in the meta. I hate that it just dies to a Virtue of Persistence, and it happens way too often. Just they only have to pay like 1 life because Virtue gains them too. But aside from that one play, this is again very well positioned against aggro and stuff like that. 2 Gix's Command. We've seen again this mono black aggro deck and even some green black decks play the full 4 of Gix's Command and eschew things like Deadly Cover Up, Path to Peril, and just play this because they're playing creatures. This will just make one of their creatures stronger or get them creatures back and just blow everything up on the opponent's side of the board a lot of the time. Just a really powerful card at the moment. Cut Down, Go for the Throat, Bitter Triumph. There's the Bitter Triumph, It's just the basic black removal package. The sideboard includes Tranquil Throwback, which you will sometimes see in the main deck nowadays, interestingly enough. But aside from that, there's not too much difference in what you'll normally see here. Sideboard isn't necessarily transitional, but you can go a little bit more controlling and slow rolling in the second game with Liliana of the Veil. Duress, just become that sort of discard deck against Azorius Control is what you're likely trying to do there. Aside from that, another Boros Convoke, another Azorius Control to round out the top 8, and then some sort of not necessarily meta-breaking decks, but slightly off-meta or more like B-tier decks in the top 16, like Rakdos Midrange shows up with its usual, complement of stuff. It's basically the same sort of black shell that we've been seeing in a lot of these decks, but it's also going to play like some red cards. Like, see, this deck plays Trumpeting Carnosaur as like the one red card in the deck, which is interesting. I can't remember having seen exactly that before, but close enough to mono black. But Trumpeting Carnosaur is a really good card. Aside from that, there's also Dimir Reanimator, which is probably crime. Yeah, it's for Reenact the Crime in this deck. So, this deck is really scratching and clawing for position. But, 1 week it'll top 8, next week it'll top 16, next week it'll drop out, next week it'll top 8. So it's really trying, but it is firmly establishing itself as a sort of B-tier wonder at the moment. But moving over to the Wizards Play Network qualifier, this one only had one surprise, and it's no longer really a surprise, and it's Bant Toxic. This is the only effectively perfect record at the tournament, 7-0-1, so there was a draw. But this deck doesn't really introduce too much new technology. It's just very straightforward. This deck did go all the way and play 4 Aspirant's Ascent, which is not necessarily something you always see. You'll see some number of this card, or even 0 a lot of the time. But this deck, again, 4 whole copies, which is pretty amazing. If you get a Jawbone Duelist through with it, like let's say you Skrelv a Jawbone Duelist in, and then Aspirant's Ascent, I believe that is 4 instances of Toxic that'll hit twice. So that's 8 poison just by itself. So if you can do that, you're doing pretty well. And this deck can out-tempo decks like, Control for one, but it also doesn't necessarily have to worry as much about what aggro's doing, and you're racing them in a different way where they kind of start with half of their starting life total, and you don't even have to deal combat damage to them. Obviously, this deck has all the Venerated Rot Priest setups that we're used to with March of Swirling Mist. It can also just Aspirant's Ascent its own Venerated Rot Priest to kind of finish things off. Bring the Ending as a counter spell. You've got Serum Snare for tempo, and then Fading Hope for tempo. Sometimes you'll see more than 2. This player's on 2, though. That's probably to work in more Squel's Hive into the main deck against the more common control matchup nowadays. Somebody just asked me the other day, is there a tempo deck in Standard? And I set out to make like a blue-white tempo deck with a bunch of flash creatures and counter spells and stuff. And honestly, I should have remembered that this is really the tempo deck that's currently in Standard, right? You want a Skrelv on 1, you want a Venerated Rot Priest in there somewhere. You don't want to be attacking. You don't always see this Slaughter Singer, but if you do have to resort to just attacking, Slaughter Singer is obviously fantastic. So, it gets through Toxic 2, Toxic 3 if you Skrelv it in, again, Toxic 4 if you Aspirant's Ascent. So a lot of little tricks like that. And then obviously a little bit of removal in the sideboard like Annex Sentry. You've got Destroy Evil to take care of enchantments and large creatures. Spell Pierce is a given. Filigree Silex is a really interesting include in the board. The 4 Slaughter Singers here. Get Lost, Knockout Blow, Bring the Ending, Skrelv's Hive, and Negate. So the 4 Skrelv Hive against Control. And the Negate is probably against Control a lot of the time too, but it also counters like Gix's Command and Sunfalls from other non-control decks. So really interesting that this deck keeps performing so well and yet is on so few people's minds when they do sort of meta-analysis, because it is not uncommon at all nowadays to see Bant Toxic just take down an entire tournament. I think it's an easy deck to forget about, but you shouldn't. Azorius Control was also here at this tournament. Any differences in this list? Yes, this is a Jace list. You're not seeing this in every single list, but this plays 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. Really good if you can land it against other control decks, it turns out. And again, those control mirror matches are becoming more and more common. I don't know how much control was at this particular tournament because we don't see any other Azorius control list in the top 13 that we can see right now. Domain Ramp is here. Its only appearance in either of these big tournament top 8s that I can remember. Yeah, no Domain Ramp here. So this deck, I've seen a lot of people sort of put it at different places in the meta. People still think it's S tier. Some people think that it's moved down into A tier or even B+. And I'm not sure it's there yet, but I don't think the deck is any longer S tier. I don't think it's at the top of the format in best of 3 right now. I think Azorius is too good against it, to be honest, and the Azorius matchup gets more and more common every day. It also gets, again, like out-tempoed by decks like Bant Toxic, and often it has a poor matchup against Dimir as well. So, but we see Dimir just after it, and again, a very similar deck to the ones that we were just looking at in the last tournament. This particular deck plays 1 Malcolm. We've also got a mono red aggro at 3-1, so again, another decent finish for mono red. This one playing the Squee and the Godrix, not playing the Crimson Pulse and stuff. So a different list. This one a little bit more traditional. Esper Legends is here. We see Esper mid-range, but we don't see it labeled Legends as often so much anymore. And this isn't really even a Legends deck. This is just 2 Denic, 4 Rafine, 1 Aquazotz. No Shieldred in the main, no Shieldred in the 75. So this is more sort of the Dimir tempo or the Esper tempo deck. That's been popping off. Simic Artifacts is the only real surprise here. Just barely a winning record on the day, which I really like, but we saw this deck in the last video that we looked at. This one playing the Goose Mother. Let me actually jump into this one. This one playing the Goose Mother, which you don't often see, right? This is mostly a Zoetic Glyph deck, and you do see that here. But it's got some sort of late game punch, I guess, with the Goose Mother, which I do like. It's also got a Malevolent Hermit in there to counter stuff, which I think is cool. But we see this deck performing somewhat well these last couple of weeks, but not really breaking through, although a top 8 finish is good. Azorius Mentor here, our first non-winning record deck, but still managed to eke its way into the top 8. This is a deck that had a breakout last week, so I'm not surprised to see people playing it this week. As far as other stuff here, the only real surprise in the top 16, I guess there's 2 of them, and they're both kind of gruely decks. First of all, another Dimir Reanimator in the top 16. Should point that out. But there is also a Teamer Ramp deck. This one, of course, not a winning record, but this is the World Souls Rage deck, the new Fireball from MKM that made a little bit of noise at the beginning of the format. You play Spelunking along with stuff like Splendid Reclamation usually, but I note this deck isn't doing that. This deck isn't doing Splendid Reclamation. It's not doing Aftermath Analyst or anything like that, like you often see with stuff like this. We're just trying to ramp. Ill-Timed Explosion is our sweeper. Burn Down the House is our sweeper. Get a little tempo with Fading Hope, and then eventually Ill-Timed for a lot into another Ill-Timed. I'm not sure about it, but top 16 is top 16 is top 16. The other kind of surprising one is Gruul Aggro. This one has been trying to break out on MTG Arena in best of 1 for a while, but we very rarely see it in best of 3. That said, here it is right here. It's the Cacophony Scamp deck. Basically, just a 1-mana 1/1. When it deals combat damage, you can sack it. If you do, proliferate. When it dies, deals damage equal to its power to any target. I don't know why I read that to you. If you play any arena, you've seen this card before. But, Questing Druid, Seek the Beast is like the green card in the deck. Sometimes you will see cards like Audacity and Tyvar's Stand or whatever it's called, the one that puts a roll token on them. But also gives them hexproof till end of turn. Just played it the other day. But anyway, sometimes you'll see those to kind of protect your dudes in this deck, but this one not doing that. Another deck playing Case of the Crimson Pulses. That's kind of interesting. But yeah, the story this weekend was, aside from maybe Bant Toxic, which if you don't think it's a meta deck, then I don't think you're paying enough attention. But still, the story was the meta strikes back this week. The big decks like Boros Convoke ended up taking down a tournament and getting another deck in the top 8, another deck just in the top 9 right there. So Boros Convoke at the one tournament, and then at the other tournament, you had Bant Toxic, but a lot of Azorius Control kind of lurking about. There's one in the top 2 of this tournament, and then Azorius Control right here, Azorius Control 2 in the top 8 of the RCQ. So again, those mirror matches are becoming more and more common. Dimir Tempo kind of hanging around top 8s too. There's 2 Dimir decks in this top 8, and then a Dimir deck here in this top 8. So again, another deck that you have to deal with an awful lot. Go. And I guess Mono Red Aggro kind of restaking part of its claim. If there's one kind of story about a deck that's gotten kicked out of the meta, over this past week at least, it looks like Esper Legends and Domain Ramp are ceding some of their control of the meta. Over these last few weeks, it seems like Esper and Domain are everywhere, and not necessarily so at these tournaments. We don't see a single Esper deck in the top 8 of this tournament. The only problem I would say with that theory is season finale. Yeah, the Solaris tournament scene. This, I believe, is this is the one where one format is like Pioneer, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's one format is Modern and the other format is Standard. And you'll note that all of the players that chose, a winning Standard deck, Esper midrange, Esper aggro, Dimir, Azorius, Esper, Golgari. So Esper, I think, is still, in a lot of people's minds, the sort of benchmark deck in the format, followed in a lot of ways by Domain Ramp, which is a defining deck in the format too. The defining aggro deck at the moment is Boros Aggro, right? So the defining mid-range decks are Dimir and Golgari. So again, I think the format is somewhat concrete. No noise from Slowgurk or any other weird long game control decks that beat Azorius or anything this week. But again, I don't think that we're necessarily out of the woods. I think it's entirely possible that someone could figure out the right way to beat Azorius while also beating, Golgari or something, or also beating Dimir. And then at that point, they would have a pretty good spot in the meta, right? And there's definitely a lot of digging to do and sort of extracting the right cards that I think is still ready to take place. We've seen a lot of evolution in the meta. Even with this sort of reclaiming of the meta, we see some decks dropping out. Again, but Esper and Domain Ramp are not as prevalent. And I think even that is sort of a ray of sunshine when you're analyzing the current meta. But in any case, that's all I've got for this one. Just let me know how you felt about everything this weekend, what you think the strongest decks are right now, and I'll be talking about that again very soon, because before the weekend is out, we're going to be doing sort of a tier list for Standard. It's something I haven't done in a while, but I do think it's a good time to do it. I have my opinions, but let me know what yours are. What are the strongest decks in Standard? If there is an S tier, what is it? If there's an A tier, what is it? So just give me all your thoughts down there and do the YouTube stuff on your way out. Like the video, sub to the channel if you want more stuff like this and other goofy, wacky stuff that I do. You can check out the Patreon, just $1 a month to vote on content and really, really help support the channel if you're into it. But just glad that you're here watching, to be honest. But anyway, I'll see you guys next time. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.